meetings. This involves supporting investor members in their efforts to promote respect for internationally recognized human rights through the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights among portfolio companies. Now, the growing influence of the information and communication technologies sector, or the ICT sector, has really reconfigured every aspect of our lives for better and for worse. I think the positive force of technology is now on full display, helping us to stay connected at a time that really demands our physical isolation. Paradoxically, though, the same technologies that are really necessary for connecting us now have also been contributing to greater isolation of individuals and society over the past decades. So this is in addition to a range of other adverse impacts of technology on human rights, ranging from privacy to freedom of expression, to discrimination, conflict, and political participation, to name a few. And in fact, the ICT sector is also lagging behind other high-risk sectors when it comes to the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles. This fact was highlighted in the latest corporate human rights benchmark, which was released in November of 2019. The benchmark found that ICT manufacturing in particular is lagging behind the agricultural product sector, apparel, extractive industries, with regard to disclosure of human rights policies and processes. In fact, not a single ICT company scored above 50% on the benchmark, and more than 2/3 scored below 20%. So, while ICT companies appear to disclose on specific issues relatively well, they fall behind in more systematic approaches to respecting human rights, or at least disclosing efforts to respect human rights. So to address this situation, in 2018, the steering committee of the Investor Alliance identified the ICT sector as a priority sector to promote robust human rights governance systems, policies, and due diligence processes. And since then, our members have been engaging with some of the world's largest tech companies, including Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter, on human rights. So in today's discussion, our speakers will share their incredibly valuable insight and work aimed at tackling this intersection of human rights and technology. Dr. Christine Chow of Hermes will be leading the discussion and introducing our speakers. So before I pass off to Christine, who's also, I should have mentioned, a member of the Investor Alliance, I'd like to just run through a bit of logistics. First, we are recording this webinar, and we will share the webinar recording after with participants. Right now, everyone is muted for this participation, for this part of the presentation, rather. But if you have questions, you can, I believe, raise your hand or add your questions in the chat box throughout the discussion, and we'll read those out later. We can also unmute you at the time of Q&A. And so I think those are the main points to share now. So with that, I'm going to pass off to Christine.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Great. So in terms of ICT, there are companies that seem to be much more powerful in the ICT sector, and there are other ones that are not. So the ones that we're talking about today are actually the ones that have an impact on every aspect of our lives. So just going back to a little bit on how we started looking at human rights. I think in the early days, we looked at obviously content governance in the broader sense, and it has always been something that puzzled us because of the power that some of the technology companies have in controlling what we can see, what we're allowed to see. And of course, the political campaigning incidents have brought the issue to the forefront. But at the same time, there are different ways of looking at different aspects of human rights as well, from data privacy to the fact that a lot of people are involved in doing the content moderation. So I'm going to be very brief today, and I'm just going to introduce the speakers and hope that more people can join in, because I think the speakers will be able to give you a more personal understanding and their own experience of what the impact of human rights is. So the first one is Elias, Dr. Elias. I wouldn't try to pronounce your surname. I don't want to get it wrong. But we met when. Sorry. Yes.
Just helping out with my last name, Aboujaoude.
Yes, we met last year when I was in California, when I attended the AGM at Alphabet, and how we got get to know each other was very interesting because I was on the BBC Radio 4 interview the evening before the Alphabet AGM. And at the interview, we talked about different aspects of human rights related issues and AI governance and board oversight and the importance of content governance, etc. And one of the topics I mentioned was actually the struggle on the front line, what we call it, is the many people who are in human moderators that are given a community guideline that might get changed very often because the internet is constantly evolving. And they have to make very difficult decisions as to whether certain content is appropriate to be shown. Because on one aspect, they are pretty much controlling the freedom of expression. And at the same time, they are also having to make very difficult decisions as to whether something can stay or need to go. And that actually put a lot of psychological and mental pressure on a human being. And these people might not be working in office like what we're all doing now. They could be working from home. They could be working in an isolated environment without much support whilst making those very difficult decisions. So when that interview came out, Elias actually got in touch and we managed to meet. And he'll be able to share with you or a little bit later of his own experience of meeting these content moderators and what goes through in their lives and the impact of their job. So the second speaker I want to introduce is Emil Kernel. He is the Human Rights and Business Advisor of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. He advised companies on how to implement the UN guiding principles. The third one is Danielle from Robeco. We've been working together over the last just short of a year, looking at how we can leverage and collaborate as an investor community to be able to make our voice stronger, to engage with big tech companies to address human rights issues more appropriately. So I'll leave it to the three speakers and hopefully to speak with you all at a later stage. Thank you.
So over to you, Elias. I think you're on mute.
Are you able to see my slides?
No, unfortunately. There, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining. I hope you are healthy and safe wherever you are joining from. My name is Elias Aboujaoude, and I'm based at Stanford University in Silicon Valley, which is where I'm dialing in from. I'm going to be talking about some psychological problems that have been shown to be associated with internet-related technologies, but I'll end hopefully on a positive note, sharing some reasons for optimism. We're talking a lot these days about globalization in the age of Corona, but really the main tool of globalization has been the internet. And before we launch into problems associated with the internet, psychologically speaking, it's important to recognize that for a lot of people, the internet brings a net psychological benefit to their lives, from connectedness to increased freedom from inhibitions, increased productivity, entertainment. All this can be associated with a positive psychological charge. But for a certain proportion of the population, the relationship with internet-related technologies starts looking like a pathology, starts meeting the criteria for what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is the big Bible, if you will, of psychiatric diagnoses, the DSM's overarching definition of a psychological problem, meaning a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome associated with present distress or significantly increased suffering, death, pain, disability, etc. Now, the history of investigation into problems associated with the internet is actually not new. It dates back to 1996. In epidemiology, whether it's HIV or corona, we like to think of patient zero, the very first case associated with a particular problem. Well, for this issue of internet addiction, patient zero was described already in 1996. A 43-year-old homemaker with a normal home life and no prior addiction, who became hooked to the internet in a way that cost her her career and her personal relationships. Now, since then, since 1996, a really large body of evidence has accumulated about all sorts of potential psychological negatives associated with our relationship to internet-related technologies. And this evidence covers various cultures, various age groups, and various online activities. The strongest evidence, the most convincing evidence, is biological data about dopamine dysfunction. As you may know, dopamine has been implicated in several addictions, both to substances and to behaviors like gambling. And there's evidence that dopamine dysfunction may be at play in some people's relationships with internet-related technologies. Other data points to tissue disorganization within the brain and poor brain connectivity among some folks who develop problems in their relationship, again, with internet-related technologies. So all this data, and especially the biological data, has contributed to internet gaming disorder being included in the appendix to the latest DSM. It came out in 2013, and to be formally included as well in the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, which came out in 2018. Now, of all the internet activities, what the World Health Organization, what the DSM focused on was gaming disorder, so online video games, and that's because some of the best data of all the online activities, some of the best data pertains to video games specifically. But what is lost in our focus on internet addiction and on video games specifically is the personality changes that happen online, from aggression to impulsivity to narcissism, etc. These don't get nearly the attention that they deserve, and yet they are a big part of our new virtual psychology, and they are changing the world as we know it, politically and in every way. So if we focus too much on addiction and we focus too much on gaming, those of us who don't meet criteria for addiction, those of us who don't play video games, feel deceptively immune to the potentially negative transformative powers of the internet. And this is what I chose to focus on in my book, Virtually You. When it came out, the New York Times reviewed it, and they called me the Hobbes of the internet. Hobbes being the most pessimistic, philosopher in the history of humankind. And I take no pleasure in saying that since then, a lot of things I've warned about have come to materialize, from issues of privacy violations to effects on democracy, rise of demagogues, etc. And I'm going to try to highlight some of these issues in the rest of the time I have, starting with aggression. Now, online aggression does not necessarily stay there. We have quite a bit of evidence now about violent video games, for example, translating into offline violence. And this data started to appear as early as 2008, as this reference shows. This particular study looked at kids in the US and Japan, so two very different cultures in terms of their relationships to violence, and violent video games in both these cultures led to offline violence down the road later on in the academic year. So online violence doesn't stay there, and it is quite different from violence in other media, from TV to movies to radio even, because of the interactive nature of the internet. It's very much like life. It rewards us, it punishes us, and because of that, it's easier to transpose some of the online aggression and online negativity, transpose it offline. Another area I've looked at is cyberbullying compared to offline, traditional, if you will, bullying. The cyberbully is often unknown. This can make the victim globally paranoid because they don't know where the attack is coming from. It can happen around the clock. If you have a cell phone, it's never off. So it's more diffuse that way. And there's this interesting phenomenon of the bully victim. It's easier for the victim to become a bully himself or herself, and that's something that we don't see in traditional bullying. So physical attributes of strength, etc., aren't as important, and it's easier for the attacks to go viral and for there to be a permanent record of them online, re-traumatizing the person. Up to 40% of kids have been victimized, with females and sexual minorities being at particularly high risk, and there's a link to suicide. There's this also new phenomenon that we're still really trying to understand of self-cyberbullying. So these are people, kids mostly, who will anonymously post negative things about themselves. You should jump off a roof and kill yourself. If you don't kill yourself tonight, I'll do it for you. Very troubling phenomenon. Is it an attention-seeking type behavior? Is it a cry for help? We're really still trying to understand this, and it affects about 6% of the population. I mentioned suicide because historically suicide has been described as aggression turned inward. So I'm placing it under the aggression personality effects. Suicide rates had been going down steadily over the decades, but there's been a clear jump, 24% from 1999 to 2014 in the US across age groups. And many potential explanations have been proposed, but the internet, I believe, has also played a role. It's very easy to find foolproof recipes on how to end your life, unfortunately. You can also learn new methods that in the old days would have required a lot of research. You can also find other people who will encourage you to carry out the act. So these are some of the ways that the internet has transformed the suicide landscape and potentially helped in this increase we've seen in the rates of suicide. Now, we've always in psychiatry and psychology asked people if they have a weapon at home. The really must ask new question is, have you been Googling suicide lately? Because oftentimes the internet is the first step in that very complicated and tragic process of carrying out a suicide. So moving on to narcissism, another personality trait that is fed and reinforced online. In its many attempts to make a comeback, Yahoo has tried many campaigns. This one here, I think, is particularly telling in terms of how many people approach the internet. Now the internet has a new personality, yours. The internet is under new management, yours. There's a new master of digital universe, it's you. The internet really puts us in the driver's seat, and if you have any sort of narcissistic tendencies, they can be fed through likes counters or friends counters, or the very name followers on Twitter can kind of feed into that. Many technologies help us sort of configure our online environment to only read the articles that we like to read, to only listen to the music that we like to listen to only watch the videos that we know we like. And it's hard to complain about this because we all crave tools that match our interests. But the downside to this is that as we grow accustomed to having our very last need met and our universe personalized like that, we can grow more entitled, i.e. potentially more narcissistic. Now, again, all data supporting this starting in 2008 or so. Much more data has accumulated since then. I like to point out to some old studies because I like to highlight that these issues that seem obvious now are not really new. We've been trying to talk about them and highlight them for some time. Moving on to impulsivity, another personality trait that is fed online, and one of the ways we measure impulsivity is to see how impulse control disorders are modified or change when they move online. Examples of impulse control disorders are gambling disorder, and there's quite a bit of data now that shows that people who are online gamblers do more damage in terms of their gambling behavior compared to offline gamblers. And this kind of phenomenon led the American Psychiatric Association a number of years ago to issue a warning against online casinos, and this eventually led to online casinos being banned in the US. We can't say that technology doesn't sometimes help with the problems it creates. I like to give the example of this particular program from that Google experimented with a few years ago called Goggles. And here's what a Google engineer who worked on it had to say. Sometimes I send text messages I shouldn't send, like the time I told a girl I had a crush on her over text message, or the time I sent that late night message to an ex-girlfriend that we should get back together. Gmail can't always prevent you from sending these messages that you might later regret, but today we're launching a new feature which may help. When you enable Mail Goggles, it will check that you're in a sound mind to send that late night Friday email, and what better way to do that than by making you solve a few math problems to verify that you're in the right state of mind. So when you hit send, Goggle throws up 5 math problems that you have to answer correctly. And in a blog that I was reading, kind of commenting on this new feature, one of the discussants, called themselves Beta Delta, said, I think the math problems should be like this, and they proceed to list 4 increasingly impossible equations. So this is someone who was obviously negatively impacted by online impulsivity, and I think most of us can relate to this, and most of us can relate to how easy it is to become more impulsive online, even if we never met criteria for internet addiction or we never played a video game. Moving on to another concept that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves research-wise, and that I've tried to look at, is the whole issue of what it means to live in a post-privacy world now. Already in 1999, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems made this very disturbing but very prescient, it turns out, statement. You have zero privacy anyway, get over it. Okay, 1999. Well, the years and the decades have proved him right, unfortunately. And there's a real psychological downside to this reality. Privacy mediates crucial psychological functions, from contemplation, rejuvenation, catharsis, recovery. All these have been shown in data, in studies, to be important psychological functions that require privacy, that require the possibility of anonymity, that require really the basics of privacy, these basics that internet-related technologies have slowly chipped away at, when privacy should be a human right. Facial recognition has brought real attention now, and really brought this whole thing home, from stories of political surveillance to, you know, daily apps that people use that on the surface can maybe be fun in some way until you really think of how disturbing they are. And this is just one example of such an app called Find Face. You take a picture of someone like this unsuspecting subway rider, and then you put it into the app, and you can find her social media accounts and thereby identify the person. So all these are examples of this particular app, and they highlight the fact that privacy really is a thing of the past, and they highlight the consequences of what it means to live in this post-privacy world. So the combination of ever more intrusive technologies, such as facial recognition technologies, or the problems with the Internet of Things, for example, the combination of that, plus real political consequences that have become obvious now, such as social media manipulation of elections, rise of demagoguery, threats to democracy. We went from thinking of the internet in the early days, if you look at some of the old literature, they thought of the internet as an Athens without slaves, Athens being the first democracy, but they had slaves. The internet doesn't have slaves, so it was like a perfected and improved democracy. We went from thinking of the internet as that to thinking of it as a threat to democracy. So again, the political consequences plus these new, very intrusive technologies have made users question this blind love affair with technology and have made them demand accountability. So it's a new chapter in terms of how users approach internet-related technologies, but it's also a new chapter, I think, for businesses. Businesses are expressing the desire to be good citizens now. And part of it might be that Silicon Valley is starting to lose its cool factors. You know, I work in Silicon Valley, and if you are an engineer for a social media company now, you know, you really, you kind of hide the fact that you work for a social media company. It's not something to be proud of. And this is a tremendous shift from only 3 or 4 years ago. And it has led to some moves, maybe PR moves, maybe genuine moves, I don't know, but very public statements, such as IBM and Microsoft signing the Vatican Pledge recently for ethical AI, or Alphabet calling for a moratorium on facial recognition. So businesses also are expressing this desire to do better when it comes to regulating technology or keeping human rights in mind as we approach technology. Finally, regulatory bodies, governments, etc., are taking a more active role. This has been the case in the EU for some time with the right to be forgotten or the GDPR. In the US, it's becoming more of a reality as well. So all this is quite a change. Not that long ago, really the approach to trend is very much a laissez-faire attitude. Any intervention in this world could harm this new industry, and we should just let the internet self-police. Well, we know better now, and we know better than to think of sites as passive hosts. You know, it used to be in the US that the Communications Decency Act, really from 1996, still, you know, regulated most interactions and looked at sites as passive hosts. They're not publishers, so they can take, they have no responsibility for what happens on them, what gets published on them, what people do on them. They had immunity against such liability. Well, this is starting to change. So the body of research that is accumulated, combined with this increased public awareness of the downsides of technology, makes this the right moment to act. But you cannot expect users, you cannot expect individuals to act on their own. I, as a user of Google, cannot possibly on my own, you know, take the measures I need to take to protect privacy. But the balance of power between users on the one hand and giant tech companies is so skewed that they need help. Users need help, and we cannot necessarily count on Silicon Valley on its own to kind of readjust this skewed balance. One of the answers Silicon Valley has given us is more tech, basically using technology to regulate our use of technology. There's a whole host of new apps that are meant to wean us off apps. Screen time from Apple, Android's digital well-being, any number of them. And they basically function to turn your smartphone into a dumb phone. Not sufficient. So if you have, for example, Moment or Freedom installed, then you go to Instagram and it has Instagram blocked and tells you are free from Instagram. So a lot of these kinds of new tools are available. Might be part of a PR move, maybe mea culpa, but we should approach them with some degree of healthy suspicion, because there's an inherent conflict of interest there, right? Companies that make their money based on the amount of time you spend interacting with their products cannot necessarily be trusted when it comes to regulating and making healthier our relationship with technology. But it's part of a larger movement of tech executives talking about the dangers of tech. Any number of luminaries in tech is on the record warning about the dangers of technology. And if you look at Silicon Valley, the most popular school system is one that basically bans all forms of tech in their in their classes, and this is among the schools with the longest wait lists and really very, very popular. So these tech executives who are saying the right thing about the dangers of technology, I think may be receptive to our collective insistence now on something being done to protect things like privacy, to protect our rights as users of these technologies, and again, to readjust this equilibrium between the individual user and big tech. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn it over back to Christine or Paloma.
Thank you very much. I wonder if there are any questions, because that was quite an extensive presentation. I wonder if there's any immediate questions that might be coming from the audience.
I would just flag that there's one question that was been raised by Josh Ratner. We could take that now and then come back to do a full Q&A after Emil speaks. So sure, Josh, over to you. Josh, can you hear us? Well, it seems that Josh does, yeah, he lowered his hand. So if there are any other immediate questions, please do speak up. Okay, we can transition maybe to the next speaker. Emil?
Yes, thank you, Elias, for that, and I think that's a very nice segue for me actually, because it covered a lot of issues. So extremely briefly about myself, and I'm sure we can share some more information with the participants later on. But my name is Emil, and I work at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is Denmark's national human rights institution. We have, however, worked with business and human rights as a topic for over 20 years. And over the last couple of years, we've increasingly started working on kind of tech and human rights. So we have several ongoing projects there where we're trying to particularly look at what human rights impact assessments mean for tech companies or in relation to digital technologies in general. So if we proceed, Sarah, if you're managing the slide. So why we're even looking at this is actually, I think, explained in these kind of 3 pictures up on the screen now. And it really is to say that there is an increasing demand on tech companies and other companies that use or deploy tech to actually look at human rights, and not just maybe freedom of expression and right to privacy, which initially got all of the attention. So we have in the first picture the Human Rights Commissioner from the UN, who in her speech last summer said that we need to look at what the UN guiding principles for business human rights mean for digital technologies, and has also proceeded to start a process within the OHCHR on developing guidance to what that really means. And then we also have, many other developments, such as the EU Commission's ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, where there is not a request for human rights impact assessment as a term, but the fundamental rights impact assessment, which for all intents and purposes means the same thing. So that there needs to be an assessment of these impacts of AI systems in that particular scenario. Then we also have a recommendation from Special Rapporteur David Kay, who says that both for AI and content moderation and all of that, human rights is really the framework that should be used to assess what the impacts are. So there are a lot of requests to do something. It might be called fundamental rights impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, or whatever, but what does that mean? Sarah, if you proceed. So I'm just going to keep this very short right now because of the interest of time and taking some questions. But what I think is very important as we progress in our project on looking at human rights impact assessments for like in the digital sphere, what tech companies need to do and what investors should demand is that there are proper human rights due diligence systems. And this is easy to say, but I think this is where the connection to Elias' presentation is very clear, that we cannot start by focusing on particular issues. We need to have a multidisciplinary approach. We need to be able to grasp all the issues that whatever product or solution we develop or service we offer actually might have. And that is the human rights due diligence system that can kind of catch that at whatever stage we're talking about. Then from our point of view with the Danish Institute of Human Rights, you should then also conduct what we call human rights impact assessment, and what Special Rapporteur David Kay and others have requested. And that means that it's something extra. When you have detected the risk areas, you detected risk products, detected risk services, you need to go deeper and look at what does it really mean. And why we make this why we distinguish between this is because there needs to be a strong emphasis on external stakeholder engagement. That might be talking to people like Elias, that might be talking to civil society organizations to understand what are those impacts. But it needs to be a wide net so we can catch all of the impacts and be able to adjust the products and services. And it's very important here to mention that the rights holder perspective needs to be included. I mean, I think from the investors' perspective I'm talking to now, it would be surreal to talk to a extractive company that had not had any engagement with the local populations. Yet, at least from what we can see from reports, tech companies are at least not transparent about that they actually engage with potentially impacted individuals. So this needs to get an increased focus. Sarah, if we proceed. So the question then is, what does this mean for investors in their engagement with tech companies? Well, I think the first thing, and this is where I should really commend the work of the Investor Alliance, is that you need to stay informed about the widest possible range of impacts. You don't need to only understand the freedom of expression impacts. You need to understand, you need to join a webinar with Elias and understand some of the impacts in relation to privacy, or potential for narcissism, or potential if you create an app that is planned to get people hooked, that might be a problem. because it might lead to addiction. So you need to be able to ask, you need to be informed so you can ask the right questions. And that's the second point where I think it's just very important to engage on substance. And I know you have limited time, but if we, at this point in time, when there is very little guidance as to what the human rights impact assessment really means in kind of the tech space, to ask a company to say how many human rights impact assessments they have performed is simply not very relevant, because that can mean all kinds of things. Rather, you need to understand what the methodology has been. Have you engaged with rights holders? You know, have you identified all of these impacts and then prioritized where you take your measures? And so this lack of standards on what does it mean to do an impact assessment means that you actually have to engage on the substance. And then I think just because this is a sector where transparency has not been great, you know, maybe requests from governments, increasingly we see these transparency reports, but also to be transparent of, have you done an assessment of your salient human rights issues? Have you understood them? What are the measures you've taken? And I really would like to see, from our perspective, that the investors would push for this increased transparency. We're seeing some of that in the last year, particularly. Some of the companies that have taken maybe some more heat than others have been increasingly transparent. But of course, these are impacts that all of these companies have, and they should simply know and show, which is what the UN Guiding Principles require. And this is simply to finish off by saying that we have a project that's ongoing to develop guidance for all companies, not only tech companies, but that make use of technology or digital technologies or solutions or services or what have you. Because of course, this is not the problem that's isolated to tech companies. These impacts can occur if we think about AI models. Well, every company uses them in some shape or form. And we're currently in the drafting of this, and we will hopefully send some more information about this project for anyone who would like to engage. So I'll leave it there, so there's some time for questions. I have a lot more to say, but I'll leave it to you to decide what that is.
Thank you very much. And there is a question, and I also have a question. Maybe I'll read out one from Tracy first. When you're working on children's impacts from tech, should you be asking for a broader human rights impact assessment? And how will you approach it? And how can you translate to these companies what additional efforts they are put on in protecting children? And my added question on that is that you mentioned earlier that tech companies are not really engaging with the vulnerable, those that are potentially being impacted. But we're talking about a huge population. How, in your opinion, what might be a sensible way to approach that?
On the second question, I would say that, I mean, this is what we're also grappling with in terms of what does that really mean? What is, you know, sufficient engagement and whatnot? But I think the main point there is really that we're seeing no signs that anyone is doing too much at this point. So I think it's to get started, to think about maybe who are the civil society organizations that are criticizing you, and to challenge them to suggest mitigating measures for some of these impacts. So I don't think there's any number there, but I think it's important to just realize that that engagement needs to happen. I would also say that while, yes, you can have this kind of global spread of these technologies and whatnot, but local context is essential. So if you are in many markets, you will have to engage with civil society, or let's say if it's in a development phase of product, you probably have to go for proxies because you don't really know who the actual rights holders will be. But you can, with a good human rights solution system, at least predict who they might be, and then search for proxies, which might be also academics, it might be civil society, and simply start reaching out. So that's, you know, that's at least one requirement. So from the investor perspective, I would ask, you know, if you're the company you're engaging with is launching a new product, I mean, the first question is just, have you engaged at all? with any of the affected groups or their proxies. And then you can continue the conversation maybe from there. On the children's rights impact, again, what I wanted to say with the human rights impact assessment is that requiring that as a product or an output that you want means very little if you don't really know what it entails. So I don't think that just because you might have impacts on children, you would need to do a human rights impact assessment as some sort of closely or clearly defined activity. Rather, you would need to, again, have this kind of a engagement. You know, if it's children that are impacted by this, you would definitely need to engage with organizations like UNICEF, for example, that actually has a very competent people working on business and human rights and the children's rights. So they might be able to help you. There's plenty of resources there around gaming, for example. But when we also think of children, we also, I think another thing, a point that I would like to stress, and then I'll stop, is just that sometimes when it relates to tech companies, we think about the users as some proxies for rights holders, but actually it might many times be that, you know, children might be affected if parents are addicted to something, you know, so you also need to see that not only users are potentially impacted rights holders, but actually it could be much broader than that.
Thank you very much. I think that time is of the essence. We'll move on to Danielle, although I do have a follow-up question on children, but I will try to do that only if we have time. Danielle?
Yes, thank you very much. And I hope everyone is enjoying the webinar so far. I know I am. Very nice insights and some new perspectives for sure. Before we move to Q&A, and I'll keep it brief, I wanted to provide a bit more background on the ICT Human Rights Working Group of the Investor Alliance that Paloma already mentioned at the start of the webinar. So within this working group, investors collaborate in their engagements, obviously with ICT companies, large ones like Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. And we really focus on the impacts that these companies have on society and digital human rights, ranging from freedom of expression, privacy, but also to responsible use of AI, preventing child exploitation online. So I'm happy to hear the children's questions also addressed today, and things like violent content and live streaming of that. One of the key asks that links very well with the Danish Institute's recommendations is to ask companies to do ongoing human rights due diligence, which really includes a broad range or all digital rights issues for them to prevent and mitigate negative impacts that their services or products may have on users or society at large. And really also make sure that there is some sort of access to remedy. What is special about this working group and is quite different than the ones that are, well, the broader range of working groups out there is that we have a lot of access to experts, both in the Investor Alliance team, but also through their network of civil society organizations or researchers, like the team at Ranking Digital Rights that publishes a yearly ranking on ICT companies relating to privacy and freedom of expression. And I think this webinar is also a good example of this multi-stakeholder approach. Well, I think it's very clear, I'm repeating it, that these companies have a very large impact on society, on users. But some of these companies are also very difficult to engage with. They're very large, very powerful, and one investor alone is likely to have a very large impact. And also I see many investors concerned in the same and interested in the same issues. So I think collaboration really makes sense in engaging this ICT sector. Christine already briefly mentioned the collaboration around Alphabet, where we send a letter to the company on behalf of over 80 investors worldwide, requesting for a dialogue to discuss these issues. Unfortunately, so far, there has not been a start of that dialogue, but there's many other examples of coordinated dialogues already ongoing. And we're, for example, currently setting up online meetings with Facebook staff on both their implementation very broadly on the UN guiding principle, but also on specific issues like child exploitation online and violent content and the streaming of that through their platform. So I wanted to leave it at that. I hope if people are not yet on this group and are interested, that you reach out to either myself or Paloma, so that we can make this a bigger group and have more impact. Back to you, Paloma or Christine.
Great. Christine, I don't know if you have anything to add. We do have some questions that have come up.
I do have a follow-up question on children, but I think we should definitely address the participants' questions first.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. So there is a question here. This is actually for everyone, so we can go sort of one by one. Do you see a link between cybersecurity assurances from tech companies and human rights? Maybe Danielle, we could start with you.
Yeah, so we've engaged both on more the human rights angle in ICT, but also some companies also on their cybersecurity approach. To be honest, I think cybersecurity has already a bigger spot at the board table at the moment, or at least that's my experience when talking to companies. It's more ingrained into risk management systems. And it tends to be different teams at companies that focus on that. There is some exceptions. I think one of the positive ones is Vodafone, a telco that I've engaged with on both topics. And they have sort of an integrated team that looks at both angles because they're definitely connected. But on a general note, I would say that the human rights approach or the privacy approach is less ingrained yet at the board level or in risk management systems.
Okay. Could we, to Elias, is this something that you've looked at all?
I haven't looked at it from a research perspective, but I think it is something that gets a lot of attention and rightfully so, but sometimes focusing too much on these sort of extreme examples of cybersecurity violations can take the attention away from, daily online, problematic online issues that then kind of don't get the attention they deserve. If you have some problematic content about yourself that's, either irrelevant or untrue that you're trying to make disappear, good luck with that. But nobody seems to, want to discuss this. They want their attention to be focused on these more extreme cases. So I think I'm all for focusing on cybersecurity, but not in a way that takes the attention away from these much more common but less dramatic issues that we're talking about.
Perfect. Thank you. And Emil?
Very quickly, I can just say that, of course, cybersecurity is major issue. Particularly maybe in relation to Internet of Things and the explosion of data that could be very sensitive and that can very easily be hacked. I think the help, if speaking from the Danish Institute for Human Rights perspective, I think it's just always important to have the human rights angle to any of these discussions. Cybersecurity very quickly, translates into privacy, as Danielle was just saying. And we're currently looking into actually the requirements in under GDPR to conduct data protection impact assessments. Actually ingrains or kind of brings in the European Convention of Human Rights or the EU Charter rather. And so it comes back to human rights, and yet human rights seems to be forgotten, because I think privacy impacts in themselves. Of course, that is an impact, but it just is a gateway to just all kinds of other impacts. And I think that sometimes is forgotten, that it stays at the privacy level, that this was problematic because someone's privacy was negatively impacted. But often that might be, if there's a risk that privacy is impacted, then maybe people wouldn't join certain groups. So actually it impacts freedom of assembly, or so it actually has a lot of other impacts that we just need to consider.
Wonderful. Recognizing that we are out of time, maybe Christine.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Yes, I have a question for the three panelists. So far we've gone through the sort of more business driven type of approach to address whether there is gaming addiction or children impact. But in some markets, there are more heavy-handed and state-controlled approach. So, for example, in China, it is well known that there's a parental control system in which the local technology firms have to comply, such as limiting the game time for minors for a particular number of hours, very much top-down. And they also use facial recognition to make sure that no children are using fake accounts of adults in order to increase their gaming time. And they even extended that system to schools so that both parents and teachers can monitor the children to make sure that they are not expending their gaming time and knowing exactly what kind of websites they're going on it. So I'm thinking from your perspective, is that a good way? Or is it also infringing the rights of the children? And when we say children grow at different stages and psychologically, physically. So from age 10 to 16 could be children. And how should that transition take place in terms of control as they become adults?
I can take a little first stab. At very least, I would say that children's rights encompass so many things, and I mean, I would just say that I doubt that UNICEF would have no concerns about this model. I don't know how publicly they have been about that, but just constant surveillance and the knowledge of surveillance might have quite severe impacts on a right to leisure, right to health for children. So I mean, it will impact them. But I think to kind of bring this back and in a way give you a non-answer in some form, but still relevant. I think you need to have a children's rights expert. So if you develop, I'm bringing it back to the business side because that's what we normally work with, but if you develop a product and you realize at an early stage that this might have impacts on children's rights and potentially severe ones, well, then you need to bring in expertise that can actually conduct interviews with children or their parents to understand the implications of the rights of children. So I saw the time, so I'm going to stop there, but I think it's just important to not, again, see that is there a privacy infringement of the child in this scenario? Maybe that's not where the question should end. Is what are the implications of that in the child's behavior in general?
I'd like to add something quickly to this. I think there is room for some form of parental controls when it comes to very young children, especially. But I think the best thing parents can do is probably model good online behavior. And oftentimes what I see in my practice and talking to parents and talking to kids is that the parents are guilty of the very same things that they're trying to prevent their children from doing, whether it's excessive video game time or online aggression or cyberbullying even. So the message should go out to parents that what you do in terms of modeling good online behavior really matters, and it probably matters more than the more extreme facial recognition inspired and similar controls.
Wonderful. I'm afraid we are at time, so we're going to have to cut this conversation short. I first just want to say thanks to all of you, to Christine for kind of leading this conversation and bringing Elias into our group, for Emil for bringing his vast expertise in human rights and business and really kind of understanding the complexities for assessing human rights risks in the tech sector, Danielle for all of your incredible work in the Investor Alliance, really leading these cutting edge engagements, and all of you for participating. I will just say that if you are interested not only in engaging with the group on tech and human rights in the Alliance, but also just resources and guidance, we have available online a series of briefs that help investors engage tech companies on a wide range of salient issues. We have now briefings on privacy and freedom of expression, on discrimination, on conflict and security. And in the next week, we'll be uploading our final briefing on political participation. So how how to engage with tech companies as an investor to address these issues that we're talking about. And that's a key resource. So I invite you to look at our website and find those online. And I think with that, we'll leave it here. We'll be sharing the recording of this webinar shortly after. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Please stay healthy and looking forward to being in touch via other means soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.